I had only meant to check in just a simple message, not even a full sentence. "Where are we spending Mother's Day?" The reply came almost instantly. Oh, I only invited my mother-in-law, just the ones who really matter. I stood there, phone in hand, blinking, like maybe I'd read it wrong. But the words didn't change. No typos. No apology. Just a cheerful dismissal typed out in bright little bubbles. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't gasp. I didn't say a word. I just stared at the screen as if it might out of mercy offer me a second version, one with some softness, some grace. But it stayed there plain and casual, as if it hadn't just cracked something inside me. I leaned against the kitchen counter, the edge pressing into my hip. I hadn't prepared much today, hadn't even taken the chicken out to thaw. But still, there was a folded cloth set near the end of the counter, and 2 plates I'd taken out the night before, without thinking. It wasn't just about Sunday. It was never just about Sunday. The silence in the house had a new weight to it. My husband passed 6 years ago, and I thought I'd grown used to the quiet. But this silence hummed with something else entirely, a kind of absence that felt deliberate. I put the phone down, face down, as if that would hide it from view or stop the sting it had left behind. No follow-up message came. No just kidding, no. Of course you're invited too. She wasn't drunk. She wasn't angry. She was just honest. And that's what hurt most of all. I walked down the hall and stood in the doorway of the guest room. It still had a crib folded against the wall and a box of books I used to read to Micah, her son, my grandson, when he was little enough to curl up beside me. They hadn't visited in months, maybe longer. I had stopped counting. There was a small drawer I kept locked, not because it held anything valuable, but because it held things I wasn't ready to throw away. I opened it now. Inside there was a folded flyer, slightly faded at the edges. Haven Grove Children's Center. Volunteers needed. I had picked it up at the pharmacy last fall. Something about the children's handprints stamped across the top had caught my eye. I hadn't thought about it since. Until now. I closed the drawer softly and stood there, my hand resting on the edge. My heart felt quiet, not broken, just done. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just began to pack. I woke early the next morning out of habit more than hope. The message from Nerys still sat in my phone, unopened again since last night. I hadn't deleted it. I hadn't responded either. It just lingered, a wound that hadn't scabbed. Still, I moved through the kitchen with quiet routine. I laid out the cutlery-folded napkins the way Micah liked triangles, with the point facing up, and placed 3 glasses beside the plates. The chairs made soft scraping sounds against the floor as I adjusted them, one for me, one for him, one for her. My hand hovered over the 4th for a second, but I pushed it back under the table. I didn't know why I was doing it. Maybe muscle memory, maybe denial, or maybe some part of me still believed that message had been careless, not cruel, that she'd call back, say it was a joke, say she couldn't imagine celebrating without me. I cracked eggs, mixed flour, and stared out the window as the oven warmed. The sky was pale and clean, and the trees outside had begun to blush green again. A soft season, one that usually brought me joy. The dish I made was simple. I didn't fuss with garnishes or presentation. I just wanted something warm to put on the table, something I could offer if they came. The hours passed quietly. I kept glancing at the clock and listening for the sound of a car pulling up the driveway. Once I thought I heard one. My heart lifted foolishly, but it was the neighbor's landscaper. I wiped down the counter even though it was already clean. The table sat waiting. I didn't eat. It wasn't until late afternoon that I opened my laptop. I shouldn't have, but I did. Nerys had posted 12 photos. Brunch at a vineyard just outside of town. Her mother-in-law wore a cream jacket, pearls catching the light. Nerys was smiling, holding up a mimosa. Micah sat between them, grinning with blueberry syrup on his cheeks. The captions were breezy. 3 generations of love. So grateful for the women who raised me right. I didn't look at all 12, just enough to understand. The food in the oven had gone cold by the time I stood again. I didn't try to reheat it. I scraped the plates clean and placed them back in the cabinet one by one. I didn't cry. I didn't talk to myself. I didn't curse her name or call anyone for comfort. I just moved through the kitchen like a shadow of myself, folding cloth, washing what hadn't been used. Later that night, I opened the drawer again. The flyer was still there. My hands didn't shake as I pulled it out. I ran my fingers over the edges, then turned it over. On the back was a number with a handwritten note. Ask for Evelyn. I picked up the phone and dialed. 3 days passed. Not one message. Not even a read receipt. It was like I'd vanished from her orbit the moment I stopped being convenient. I didn't call. I didn't beg. I'd done that once years ago when Nerese moved in with her husband and forgot to invite me to her first ultrasound. Back then, I had told myself not to take it personally, that young women get busy, that she was tired, that she meant to call. Now I knew better. When someone wants you there, they let you know. I opened the hall closet and reached for the soft canvas bag I used to carry to work in the library, long before arthritis made it harder to shelve books. I didn't bother with a suitcase. I wasn't going on vacation. I folded 2 cardigans, a few pairs of slacks, my walking shoes, and 1 framed photo of Micah from when he was 5. In it, he's holding up a dandelion and smiling like he knows something secret. No toiletries beyond what fit in a pouch. No makeup. No jewelry. I didn't plan on being seen. I left the house in order. No dishes in the sink. A few cans in the pantry, labeled and facing forward like always. A loaf of bread in the freezer in case someone ever came back to check. I didn't leave a note. I didn't want to give her the chance to say I was dramatic. That I stormed out made a scene caused trouble. No, I slipped away like background noise barely noticed until it was gone. At the corner of Ashton and Winter Hill, I caught the early bus headed north. I paid cash. I paid. The driver didn't ask where I was going. He looked up, once gave a nod, and closed the doors behind me. Outside the window, houses blurred into woods, and woods gave way to fields. Somewhere past the 3rd stop, I realized I wasn't scared. It was strange how quiet resolve could be. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel reckless. I just felt done. Done waiting for the phone to ring. Done making excuses for someone who never once apologized. Done watching myself be erased in real time. I pulled the flyer from my pocket and smoothed the creases. Haven Grove Children's Center. Volunteers needed. There was an address. A town I'd never visited. A map drawn with a blue pen. Someone had circled the location and written a note above it. We need you. Come if you can. It felt less like an invitation and more like a door opening quietly, waiting to see if I'd step through. By the time the bus rolled into the station, dusk had painted everything in soft gray. I stepped off and breathed in the cool air. It smelled like soil after rain. I tightened the strap on my bag and walked toward the lit sign at the edge of the lot. Haven Grove, 1.2 miles. I kept walking. The gate at Haven Grove wasn't locked. A small brass bell dangled from a hook on the side, the kind that jingled gently when the wind nudged it. I let myself in, unsure whether I should have knocked or waited. But something about the air, quiet but not cold, told me I was expected even if no one said so aloud. Inside the front building, a woman with a clipboard looked up. She had short gray curls, sensible shoes, and a voice that didn't need volume to be firm. You must be Elgira, she said. I nodded. I'm Evelyn. You called last night. We shook hands. Hers was dry and strong, the kind of grip that doesn't linger. We don't ask for resumes. She continued, already walking down the corridor. We watch. If the kids take to you, you stay. If they don't, you don't. Simple enough. The hallway smelled faintly of crayons and something baking. A young boy darted past us barefoot and giggling. Evelyn didn't flinch. She just pointed ahead. That's West Wing. We don't separate by age here, only by bedtime routine. She showed me to a small shared room where I could store my bag and change if I needed. No locks, no keys. We're not guarding treasure here, she said. Just hearts. I spent the first hour folding laundry. Small shirts, mismatched socks, a dress with a stubborn chocolate stain I couldn't scrub out. No one asked me to. I just saw the pile and started. By mid-afternoon, a few children had peeked in. One boy asked if I was a new nurse. I said no. A girl with 2 messy braids walked right up and asked if I could braid hers too. I did, and not very well. She grinned anyway. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Evelyn handed me a tray of apple slices and said, "Let's see who finds you." We sat on the back steps and waited. The children came in waves. Curious first, then casual. Some asked my name. Others simply took a slice and sat beside me like they'd known me for years. One girl, maybe 7 or 8, lingered near the post. She had a small scar on her chin and eyes that stayed wary even when she smiled. "You can sit," I said, gently. She did. We didn't speak for a few minutes. She chewed slowly, then turned her head toward me. "You smell like a mom," she whispered. I couldn't speak for a second. She leaned her head against my arm and yawned like we'd done this 100 times before. "Marisol," she murmured. "Miss Elgira," I said softly back. And just like that, I stayed. It started with a clipboard and a soft knock at the playroom door. Evelyn poked her head in. "Elgira. There's someone here from the Daily Branch. Wants to speak with a few of the older volunteers. I told him you'd probably say no." I looked up from where I sat on the floor. Marisol curled against my side, a book, half read, in my lap. "Why'd you say that?" I asked. "Because you don't do this for attention," she replied. "But if you feel like talking," he's polite and persistent. I let Marisol finish the page before I stood. She didn't protest when I moved. That was new. The young man was waiting outside on the bench near the garden. He couldn't have been more than 25, thin and sunburnt, with a press badge that looked laminated by hand. He stood as I approached, brushing crumbs off his pants. "Miss Elgira." "Right, I'm Jonah. Thanks for making time." I almost told him I hadn't, but instead I nodded and sat across from him. He asked questions the way someone might handle a bird with a bent wing. Gently, carefully, just enough pressure to guide, not frighten. "How did you find Haven Grove? What made you want to work with children again? Was it hard to walk away from your old life?" I didn't answer everything, but I said enough. I told him I'd been a mother once. Still was, technically. That I'd spent most of my life making things easier for others, and had finally decided to do something quiet and good. Something with no expectations, no strings. He didn't press me on details. Just nodded, scribbled, listened. He asked if he could take a photo. I hesitated. Marisol, watching from the steps, ran over before I could decide. She wrapped her arms around my waist and grinned up at the camera. "It's just for the Sunday column," Jonah said, raising his phone. "One picture," I said. "And I want a copy." He promised he'd send one, but he didn't ask for my email. I figured that meant he wouldn't. I forgot about it. Days passed. The routine smoothed. I settled deeper into the rhythm of the center Band-Aid's bedtime stories, missing shoelaces, and whispered secrets that only children trust you to keep. Then on Sunday, Evelyn dropped a folded newspaper in front of me during breakfast. Front page of the lifestyle section. My name in bold. My face smiling soft-eyed Marisol on my lap. The woman who gave up everything to mother again. I read it once, then again. My own words reshaped into something tender but firm. It was honest but not cruel. Still, I felt something tighten in my chest. By the afternoon, my phone had rung 4 times from the locked drawer. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The ringing told me enough. By the 5th call, I unlocked the drawer, pulled out the phone, and watched the screen light up. Nerese. I let it go to voicemail. Then I turned the phone off again and put it back. The phone rang again that evening. Same name, same tone of urgency in the vibration. I stood at the edge of the bunkroom folding small t-shirts into plastic bins, listening to the muffled buzz like it came from someone else's life. I didn't reach for it. A part of me expected something gentler, a message asking if I was well, or even surprised acknowledgement that I had been found. Instead, when the screen dimmed, a text appeared. "You need to stop this. You're embarrassing us." No punctuation. No warmth. I read it once, not out of shock, but to be sure, as if some part of me hoped I'd misunderstood the tone. But there it was, as flat and deliberate as her voice had been the day she told me only the ones who really mattered were invited. I held the phone in my palm for a long time. It didn't burn. It didn't sting. It simply weighed more than it should have. I pressed and held the message, then hit delete. No reply. No reaction. I refused to give it life by letting it linger. Outside the window, the children were chasing fireflies. Laughter rose through the trees, pure, piercing joy, the kind that doesn't need a reason. Marisol was barefoot, her arms out like wings. She looked up and spotted me waving without hesitation. I waved back. After lights out, I sat by the doorway with my sweater draped over my shoulders. I watched their chests rise and fall in sleep, each breath so small, so steady, like a thread pulling me forward. That text echoed faintly in the back of my mind. Embarrassing. What had I done? Loved too quietly, stayed too long, left too gently. No headlines had shamed her. No words in the article named her. She recognized herself in my absence, and that was enough to wound her pride. But I didn't leave my daughter to punish her. I left because she had already turned away, and I simply stopped chasing her shadow. The next morning, Evelyn handed me a stack of name tags and asked if I'd help organize the reading corner. I pinned mine to my shirt and smiled. Miss Elgira still felt like a borrowed name, but here it was spoken with softness. By lunch, I'd already forgotten the text. It started on a night like any other. The halls were finally quiet, save for the distant creak of the building settling into sleep. Most of the children were already tucked in their small breaths, slowing in rhythm. I had just turned off the last light in the hallway when I passed the craft room door slightly ajar. I hadn't meant to stop, but something in me did. The quiet had left too much space in my chest, too much room for the kind of missing that sneaks in once the noise is gone. I thought of Micah then, not with resentment, not even sadness, just ache. That deep old ache that settles low in the bones and doesn't ask permission. I stepped into the room and sat at the work table. The supply bins were still open from earlier in the day. Yarn in soft hues, untouched needles, in a tin cup, a pair of scissors dulled at the tips. My fingers hovered over the strands until they found a pale gray wool. Almost instinctively, I pulled it out and began to cast the first row. I didn't plan the pattern. I just let it form. Row by row, stitch by stitch. While the rest of the center slept, I stayed there, shoulders hunched, fingers moving steady and sure. The hush of the room, the low hum of the heater, the occasional flicker of the hallway light. They were all background to the rhythm my hands remembered. It took 3 nights. I worked between chores, between meals, between reading to the little ones, and folding laundry that came in without labels. Each time I picked it up, it felt a little lighter, not because it wasn't heavy with meaning, but because something in me was finally letting go of the weight. On the 4th morning, I trimmed the final tail of yarn and held the finished piece in my lap. It was small, just big enough for a child's nap. Pale gray edged with white, soft enough to carry a whisper. I didn't attach a card. I didn't need to. I wrapped it in plain brown paper, taped it at the corners, and slid it into a padded envelope borrowed from the office supply shelf. No return address. No message. Just a quiet offering for a boy who would never know how much of me had once hoped to be part of his days. On my break, I walked the 2 blocks to the post office. The woman behind the counter recognized me but didn't ask questions. Anything fragile, she said. No, I replied. Insurance? No, I said again. Just regular delivery. She nodded. I watched her tuck the envelope into the outgoing bin, then close the lid with a soft thunk. That evening, back at Haven Grove, I swept the front steps slowly. Marisol had left a daisy in my shoe again, the way she always did when she wanted me to stay a little longer with her during story time. I tucked the daisy behind my ear, brushed the dust from the broom's edge, and turned toward the door. The lights inside were warm. The laughter drifting from the hallway was real. And somewhere, a child I once held might hold a piece of me again, without ever knowing the shape of what had been lost. The text came just after breakfast, while I was sweeping up cracker crumbs beneath the table where the younger ones had been making collages. The phone, silent for days, buzzed once in my apron pocket. I let it sit there for a minute before pulling it out. Micah got a blanket today. Is it from you? No greeting? No punctuation? No trace of warmth? Not even a thank you. I stared at the message thumb hovering just above the screen. I imagined her face when she opened the package, confused, maybe a little annoyed at the lack of a card. And Micah, holding something soft and unfamiliar, probably assuming it came from some company or an aunt he barely remembered. I had expected nothing. Still, the message stung. Not because she reached out, but because even now, her words carried the same tone she always used when she was backed into a corner. Not remorse, not affection, just control. A fishing line tossed into water she never planned to sit beside. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Later that day, I taught Marisol how to tie a bow. She practiced on her own shoelaces for nearly 20 minutes, her brow furrowed, fingers clumsy and determined. When she finally got it, she looked up at me breathless with pride and whispered, "I didn't think I could." "You did," I said, "because you kept trying." She beamed, and for a long moment that was all I needed. Not recognition, not validation, just a quiet success, unfiltered and real. In the early evening, Evelyn handed me a fresh stack of towels for the bath rotation. "You've been good for her," she said softly, nodding toward Marisol's empty chair. I smiled, folding the towels over my arm. She's been good for me, too. That night before lights out, I opened the drawer where I kept the phone and stared at it again. I didn't unlock it. Respect is quiet. It doesn't beg. It doesn't arrive only when something's missing. Love without respect becomes a leash. And I was done being tugged. I turned off the light, closed the drawer, and let the room settle into stillness. It started with a tickle in my throat. One of those small annoyances you think will pass with a glass of water or a good night's sleep. But by the second morning, the cough had settled into my chest like it had signed a lease. Evelyn noticed before I said anything. She handed me tea and a folded blanket and told me to stay in bed until I could speak a full sentence without wincing. "You're no good to the kids if you're running on half your breath," she said gently, but firm. I didn't argue. I knew how this worked. I'd been the one to give those orders once in a life that now felt like someone else's. So I rested. I listened to the quiet hum of the hallway, the faint thump of feet as the children went about their day. Marisol slipped in during lunch and left a clementine on my bedside table. No note. Just the fruit, perfectly peeled and wrapped in a napkin. The room felt still but not lonely. That same day, Evelyn came in with a small bag of cough drops and a look I knew well, the kind worn by people who carry news they'd rather leave outside. "Someone named Nerese called the front desk," she said. I looked up. She sounded tired. Said she'd tried reaching you. Said her mother-in-law left town for the week. Micah's been sick and she's had to manage everything alone. She asked if we could pass along a message. I waited. She said, "Tell her I miss how she used to take care of things." That's all. I didn't say anything. Just sat there, hands folded over the blanket, letting the words settle. Used to take care of things. Not I miss her. Not I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. I didn't blame her for being exhausted. I'd seen the look on many faces, mothers with too much on their plates, grandmothers pulled thin women trying to hold whole families together with silence and soup. I'd been one of them, but I also knew what it felt like to be invisible in that role, to be useful, but not cherished. I pressed the cough drop between my teeth, breathing through the sting of menthol. Evelyn stayed a moment longer, then quietly left the room. Outside, the children's laughter rose again, muffled through the windows. I could hear Marisol's voice above the others, insistent, bright, alive. And suddenly, I realized I was tired too. Tired of being the patch in someone else's torn routine. Tired of being the name they only remembered when things fell apart. Tired of carrying love like a secret someone else was too proud to claim. I lay back, pulled the blanket over my chest, and closed my eyes as the cough dulled into something I could bear. The cough lingered longer than I'd hoped. My strength came back slowly, like the morning sun behind heavy clouds, soft, reluctant, but steady. I spent the days mostly in bed, propped up with pillows, and surrounded by the quiet murmur of a place that kept moving even when I couldn't. It was the children who filled the space I left behind. They came in shifts, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, each with something small to offer. Marisol was first, of course, placing folded paper beside my pillow. A drawing of two stick figures beneath a crooked rainbow. One wore a triangle dress with frizzy hair that she explained was your bun on a windy day. Another child, Jerome, shy and wide-eyed, brought me soup in a plastic cup with the words, "Get more better soon," written in purple marker across the lid. He didn't say much, just handed it over, and shuffled back toward the hall. And then there were the others, who came not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Who sat on the edge of the bed and told me what they'd done in the garden or which book they'd picked from the shelf. They didn't expect anything in return. No snacks. No praise. They just wanted to be near me. I hadn't felt that kind of love in years. Not the kind you earn through obedience or exhaustion. Not the kind that's wrapped in guilt or family expectation. Just simple affection. Uncoaxed. Unclaimed. I found myself watching them the way a mother watches her child sleep, not with worry, but with the quiet fullness of knowing you're part of something gentle and alive. Evelyn brought fresh linens and told me I could take another few days if I needed. "The kids are fine," she said. "You gave them what matters. Now, let them return it." And so I let myself rest. Really rest. Not with one eye open, not waiting for the next demand. Just stillness, the kind that isn't filled with silence, but with peace. I thought about Nerese's message again. I miss how she used to take care of things. That wasn't love. It was memory wrapped in convenience. Love is soup in a cup. A drawing taped to your lamp. A child who sits beside you and doesn't ask when you'll get up again, only if you want to hear a story while you wait. I pulled the blanket tighter and leaned my head back against the pillow. The room still around me, full in its quiet. The messages started again, one after another. "Are you okay? I could really use you. Micah misses you. Please." Each one stacked beneath the last like a pile of unopened envelopes, heavy not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the silence before. No sign that Nerys had thought about why I left, only that I wasn't there now and she needed something. I stared at the screen from my chair by the window, the same one where I'd sat with Marisol 2 days earlier, while she showed me how she'd learned to braid using 2 pencils and a shoelace. My body was still recovering, but my mind had never been clearer. Once those messages would have sent me into a spiral questions guilt, a rush to fix something that wasn't mine to fix. I would have called back, soothed her, tried to be the mother she wanted in the moment. But this time, I didn't move. I didn't owe urgency to someone who never gave me tenderness. I didn't owe comfort to a daughter who only remembered me when she was drowning. Nerys didn't miss me. She missed the woman who folded towels, made soup, stayed up with fevers, and never asked for thanks. She missed a service, not a soul. I turned the phone face down. Outside the window, the leaves had begun to shift in color. Early signs of fall. Evelyn said the harvest fair was coming to town soon, and the children were already making paper pumpkins and acorns out of old construction scraps. There was laughter in the hallway. Someone knocked lightly on the door and left behind a cookie in a paper napkin, just as they had the day before. Love was here. It was in the details. In the space I held without needing to prove myself. In the fact that no one barged in with demands, only quiet, simple gestures that said, "You matter just like this." I glanced again at the phone. Another message had come in the preview, blinking softly across the screen. "Please, just respond." "I'm so tired." I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally did. About myself. About my peace. About giving love where it could grow instead of where it would be swallowed. Let her be tired. Let her sit with it. I had carried her exhaustion for years without ever being asked how I felt, and now that she was alone in it, maybe she'd begin to understand the weight of absence. Some lessons don't come through words. Some come only when the silence finally starts to echo. The bell rang just after lunch, sharp and quick. It was rare for anyone outside to come unannounced, especially during rest hour. I glanced toward the front hall, expecting Evelyn to handle it, but her voice floated in from the office, tied up in a phone call. I stood halfway, but Marisol tugged lightly on my sleeve. "Finish the page first," she whispered her finger, pressing gently beneath the next sentence in the book. I nodded and sat back down beside her. She read each word slowly, pausing on the tricky ones, like grateful, and remembered, mouthing the syllables until they made sense. I corrected her once, twice, never raising my voice, just letting her find her way through it. Outside the window, I caught the shape of a figure beyond the gate, then another, smaller one. I didn't have to see their faces to know. I felt it like a shift in pressure. By the time I closed the book and placed it on the table, Evelyn had returned. She stepped into the room, her brows raised in soft surprise. "There's a woman at the gate," she said. "Says her name is Nerys. She's not asking for anything. Just standing there." I nodded. "Should I?" Evelyn gestured toward the door. "No," I said. "Not yet." Marisol was still seated watching me carefully. Her hands were folded, but her knees bounced lightly beneath the table. "You okay?" she asked. I gave her a small smile. "I'm okay." Together we picked up the reading cards. I sorted them as she counted aloud, a little slower than usual. The sun filtered through the window, making warm shapes on the floor. When I finally stepped out to the porch, Nerys was still there. Micah rested in her arms, his cheek flushed, thumb tucked in his mouth. She looked smaller than I remembered, though I knew nothing about her had truly changed. The difference wasn't in her figure, it was in my posture. She didn't speak. Neither did I. We stood there in the quiet. The iron gate between us, the weight of years settling across our shoulders like shared weather. I didn't move. I didn't run to her. I didn't offer to open the gate. Behind me, I heard the soft clatter of Marisol's feet on the wooden floor, moving deeper into the building. The wind picked up slightly, pushing dry leaves across the dirt path that led to the road. Still, Nerisse said nothing. She looked at me, eyes rimmed in red arms full of a child too heavy to carry alone and too young to understand why the silence between us felt louder than ever. I stayed where I was, letting her sit in the stillness I had known for years. She didn't leave after I turned away. I thought she might. I thought pride would win, or exhaustion, or whatever, had always made her fold her arms and retreat when the world didn't cater to her rhythm. But instead, she waited, quietly. Eventually, Evelyn Ever the diplomat opened the gate and let her in without asking. She gestured in my direction, then left Nerisse to decide the next step. I didn't greet her. I didn't pull her in for a hug. I went back to the art room where glue sticks were drying out, and a pile of crumpled paper suns needed sorting. The routine was a balm, now ordinary necessary. It didn't demand performance. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. I was placing finished drawings into a folder when her voice cut the stillness. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, not quite looking at me. I nodded slightly, still not facing her. She stepped closer, watching, as I wiped glue from a plastic table. "You look," she began, then paused. Her voice dropped unsure of itself in the space. "You look happy." That made me stop, just for a moment. Not because it was wrong, but because it was true. Not joyful, not giddy, but rooted, steady. Light in a way she hadn't seen in me for years. I didn't respond. Her words weren't a question, and my peace wasn't an invitation. So I kept moving, placing chairs back under the table, stacking clean paper beside worn-out crayons. She followed me down the hallway, saying nothing, though I could feel the questions pressing at her lips. We passed 2 children, arguing softly over a puzzle a staff member, coaxing a shy boy into the reading nook. Life moved around us. She was the outsider here, not me. At the end of the corridor, she finally broke the silence again. I didn't think it would feel this way. I looked at her then, but only briefly. I knew what she meant. Loneliness doesn't always arrive as silence. Sometimes it arrives in the absence of the person you assumed would always pick up the slack. She glanced around at the walls covered in paintings, chore charts, handprints cut from colored paper, and said nothing else. I turned back to the playroom where Marisol was waiting to read me her new poem. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, and she patted the seat beside her like it had been reserved all along. I sat. Nerisse lingered in the doorway. She didn't leave when Marisol started reading. She stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor, then the ceiling, then occasionally flicking toward us, as if afraid of what she'd see. Marisol's poem was short and a little lopsided. Something about the sky, her favorite shoes, and how she loved the color orange, because it made everything feel like a popsicle. When she finished, she looked up at me for approval, not applause, not a grade, just the soft reassurance that someone had heard her. I clapped once gently and smiled. "Read it again," I said. She grinned and did just that. Afterward, she skipped off to help collect storybooks, and I rose to stretch my legs. Nerisse was still there, her face unreadable. She was never very good at letting emotions pass through. Cleanly, they always snagged, bunched, tangled somewhere behind her eyes. She took a breath, like she meant to speak, but nothing came. I waited a few beats before stepping closer. "These kids," I said quietly. "They don't want someone to tidy their messes, or remind them to eat, or check the boxes adults think matter." She looked at me, brows drawing slightly together. "They want a mother, not a maid, not a stand-in, a real one." Her lips parted like she had something to say, but then closed again. Her throat moved, and she blinked hard. I didn't speak to wound her, But truth has a way of cutting through soft skin, especially when it's been protected too long by layers of deflection. She stared at the hallway behind me, where the walls were covered in paper butterflies and construction paper hearts, most with names scrawled in crooked letters. Some had no names at all. She trailed off. I didn't help her finish. Let the silence do what my explanations never could. After a long pause, she looked at me again, quieter this time. I don't think I knew how she said, to do any of it. I know I said simply. That's why I stayed so long. She swallowed. I could see the edges of her beginning to fray, not from anger, but recognition. Something sharper than guilt, regret. In the room behind us, a child cried out, nothing urgent, just a stubbed toe or a bruised feeling. A volunteer soothed them gently, the moment folding back into calm. Nerese looked toward the sound, then back at me. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't look like someone trying to prove something. She looked like a daughter again, worn, searching, small. We ended up sitting outside beneath the maple tree near the side of the building. It wasn't a planned conversation, just a slow walk from the hallway to the wooden bench where the kids sometimes read on sunny days. The fall air was crisp but not biting, and the leaves overhead stirred quietly, like they too were waiting to see what would happen. Nerese sat beside me, stiff at first, her hands gripping her knees as though anchoring herself. Micah was with one of the other staff. He hadn't said much when I greeted him earlier, only looked at me with wide eyes, then buried his face in his mother's neck. For a while, we said nothing. It was Nerese who finally broke. I miss you, she said softly. Her voice cracked at the end, the weight of those 3 words clearly more than she'd planned to carry. She sniffled, wiped her cheek, and looked away quickly. I'm sorry, she added, her tone small now. I didn't realize how much you did, how much I needed you, until she stopped again. Her breath shook. I'm sorry, she repeated. I looked at her, not with anger, not even with sadness, just the kind of steady gaze I used to give her when she scraped her knee as a little girl and expected me to tell her whether she should cry. I know you miss me, I said calmly. She turned toward me, eyes searching. And I believe you're sorry. She nodded quickly, the hope rising too fast in her eyes. But I said gently, that's not always enough. Her face fell. Not because I said it to hurt her. I hadn't. My voice wasn't cold, it was simply tired. Worn from years of stepping around the words that should have been said much earlier. Missing someone, I continued, isn't the same as valuing them. And saying sorry doesn't fix the absence of care, especially when it's stretched over years. Her chin trembled. She dropped her gaze. I took a slow breath. I don't need an apology to survive. And I don't need to be missed to know I have worth. She nodded again, but this time slower. The tears that followed weren't desperate. They were quieter, like something had finally settled in. The wind stirred the leaves again, brushing dry sound through the branches. I didn't reach to hug her. I didn't offer a place to stay. Some things you have to sit with. We sat there side by side, the sun slipping lower, casting long shadows across the walkway. Behind us, the sound of children laughing carried faintly through the windows. I had made peace with where I was. The question now was whether she could make peace with where she wasn't. I want you to come home, Nerese said. Her voice was low, tired, raw, in a way that didn't sound rehearsed. She hadn't said it to guilt me. Not this time. It came from somewhere deeper, perhaps the first honest place in her in a very long while. I sat still on the bench. The breeze had picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint sound of children's laughter behind the building. I stared out at the yard, where Micah had toddled beside her just an hour earlier. He'd clung to her hand, uncertain around the others, uncertain even around me. I mean it, she said again. I want you back. We could start over. She looked at me with eyes brimming with regret and hope, trying to offer something she wasn't even sure how to hold. "I'm not angry anymore," she added, "and I don't want to do this alone." I let the words settle. I didn't rush to answer. I didn't reach for her hand or search for a soft ending. "I'm not going back," I said gently. She blinked. "Why not?" It was a fair question, but not a new one. "Because this isn't about who needs me most," I said. "It's about where I am most myself." She looked confused, then hurt. For years I went on. I lived in a house where I was needed every minute, but never once chosen. Not really. I was convenient, familiar, expected. She looked away ashamed, but I kept speaking. Not to wound her, but to finish something I'd never had the courage to before. Here, I'm not just a helper. I'm not a placeholder for someone else's mothering. I'm seen. I'm asked for, not demanded. I'm loved with open arms, not used until I'm empty. Nerys wiped a tear and nodded faintly. "I know you're trying now," I said, my voice softening, "and I believe that matters. But going back would mean walking away from a life I finally built with both feet under me." Silence stretched again between us. "I can still be part of your world, Nerys," I added. "But I won't shrink to fit into it." She looked at me for a long moment, then at the building behind me. The laughter inside had faded into soft hums. Voices reading shoes, padding on linoleum, quiet care, happening without spectacle. "I didn't think you'd stay gone this long," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd want to," I replied. And that was the truth. I hadn't planned any of it. Not the leaving, not the center, not the strange full peace that had replaced the ache. But sometimes, what starts as escape becomes something else. Sometimes absence gives birth to clarity. She nodded again, slower this time. There was no fight left in her, just the slow, inevitable reckoning that some bridges aren't burned. They're simply no longer needed. Behind us, a small face appeared in the doorway. Marisol peeking with wide eyes. "I should go," Nerys said. I stood brushing crumbs from my skirt. She didn't hug me, and I didn't ask for one. We had crossed something together, but not enough to turn around. I walked her to the gate, watched her and Micah climb into her car, and then I turned back toward the center, toward the room where a child waited with a paper crown in her hand, hoping someone would notice she'd made it for me. He was heavier than I remembered. Micah hesitated at first when Nerys nudged him toward me, unsure if it was okay. His little hands clung to the edge of her coat. But when I knelt and opened my arms, he came forward slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration, like he was solving a puzzle only his heart could finish. When he reached me, I wrapped my arms around him and held him close. His head tucked under my chin, just like it used to when I rocked him to sleep in the months after he was born. His body was warm, legs swinging gently with no rush, no words. For that moment, we were suspended in something softer than memory. Not what was owed, not what was broken. Just presence. "I missed you," he said into my sweater. I closed my eyes. "I missed you too," I whispered. I wanted to stay like that just a minute longer. But I didn't hold him tighter. I didn't bury my face in his curls or ask him to remember me every day. I had learned finally that love wasn't about clutching. It was about choosing when to let go with grace. So I bent down and whispered into his ear, "You're going to be strong and kind and brave." He shifted slightly, listening. "Always tell the truth, even when it's hard. Take care of your mama. And remember, there's more than one way to be loved in this world." He didn't answer, but he nodded the top of his head, brushing my chin. I stood slowly and turned to Nerys. Her face was pale, eyes glassy. I placed Micah's hand back into hers. "You're his mother now," I said. A pause. "You always were." It wasn't a dismissal. It wasn't surrender. It was a handoff with no bitterness in the exchange, only boundary. A line drawn not to punish, but to protect what had finally healed. She nodded, pressing her lips into a trembling line. I didn't say anything more. Micah looked between us, sensing something final in the way we stood. He reached for a dried leaf from the ground and slipped it into my palm. "A present," he said. I tucked it in my pocket, smiled, and stepped back. Nerese turned to go Micah's hand in hers, and I stayed behind, still on the gravel path, as their figures faded down the drive. Not because I was left behind, but because I had somewhere else to return to. The children were already digging when I came outside, little hands in mismatched gloves scooping loose soil into uneven mounds. The marigolds sat nearby in plastic trays, orange and gold, their petals full and stubborn against the breeze. I knelt beside Marisol and handed her a trowel. "Go slow," I said. "Let the soil tell you where it wants to give." She nodded solemnly, as if we were burying treasure. In a way we were. It had become a tradition, each child planting something for the season. Evelyn called it our growing corner. I called it something else in my heart. A place where things bloomed even after being forgotten. A garden of mothers, perhaps. The kind you become through choice, not blood. I saw her then. Nerese. She stood near the fence just outside the reach of our tools and laughter. Not intruding, not turning away. Just watching. She looked older than she had the day she arrived. Not from time, but from realization. The kind that doesn't leave a mark on the skin, but carves something deeper into the posture. I didn't wave. She didn't call out. Marisol brushed her arm against mine, smudged with dirt. "This one's for you," she said, pointing to a marigold with double blooms. I smiled. "Then we'll plant it together." As we dug a small hole, I caught a glimpse of Nerese through the corner of my eye. Her face had softened, not with sadness, but with understanding, the kind that hurts more because it arrives too late. I could see it land in her eyes, the truth. She wasn't the center of my world anymore. Maybe she never truly had been. Maybe she had mistaken my loyalty for orbit, my availability for devotion. But I had always belonged to something else, even if I didn't know it back then, to the quiet work of care, of showing up without applause, of creating space where others could become whole. Now I had chosen that life fully, and I wasn't apologizing for it. The marigold settled into its patch of earth, its leaves trembling, as Marisol patted the soil around its base. A few feet away, another child laughed as a worm wriggled through their palm. We were alive here. We were not waiting to be chosen. We were choosing ourselves, each other. I stood and brushed the dirt from my knees. The garden wasn't perfect, patchy, in places crooked rows, but it was full. It was ours. When I looked up again, Nerese was still standing there, her arms folded loosely, expression unreadable. But she didn't step forward, and I didn't invite her in. Instead, I turned back to the bed of flowers, lifted the watering can, and moved to the next bloom where another small hand was already reaching. I found it tucked inside an old appointment folder between faded receipts and yellowing notes I no longer needed. I recognized the curve of my handwriting right away, slanted, deliberate, pressed too hard in some places, like the paper had been asked to carry too much. I remembered writing it. It had been after Micah's 2nd birthday, when I sat alone on the back porch of the house and watched the last of the balloons deflate. The party had been full of polite smiles and oversweet cake, and I'd stood at the edge of every photo holding napkins and taking pictures instead of being in them. That night, I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote a letter to my daughter. Not to shame her, not to scold, but to try and reach whatever part of her might still remember who we were before obligation replaced affection. I unfolded it now, years later, under the soft hush of the afternoon sky at Haven Grove. I sat on the bench behind the tool shed, my quiet corner, where the breeze carried the scent of soil and the low hum of children reading inside. The letter was shorter than I remembered, but the words stung even now. I miss you when you're in the same room, I'd written. I bring things you never notice. I make space you never see. And somehow I'm still too much. There was no bitterness in the sentences, only ache. That kind of loneliness that settles bone deep when you're surrounded by people and still feel unseen. I finished reading, folded it slowly, and placed it in the shallow tin bowl I'd used for clippings earlier that morning. Then I struck a match. The flame caught quickly, small at first, then growing as the edges curled and darkened. I watched the ink twist and vanish into smoke, watched my own grief transform into ash. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. There was no ceremony to it, only a quiet farewell to the version of myself who had once needed that letter to be heard. Some stories don't need to be reopened. Some truths don't need an audience. They only need release. When the flame died, I scattered the cooled ash into the dirt beneath the marigolds, and then I stood, brushed my hands clean, and went back inside, where someone was waiting to show me their drawing of a butterfly. The rain had come in soft and steady that morning, trailing down the windows like it had nowhere else to be. The children were gathered inside, legs crossed on worn rugs, the room filled with the scratch of crayons and the rustle of picture books being turned page by page. Esty had been quiet all morning. She wasn't sick, just small in that way children become when the weather presses close. Her pigtails were uneven from trying to do them herself, and she had one sock missing. She wandered over as I sat in the reading nook, my knitting needles resting idle beside me, and without a word climbed into my lap. No demand, no permission sought, just the silent understanding that some laps are built for safety. She nestled against me, her curls damp from the window condensation, her hands warm from holding a marker too long. I reached for the edge of the quilt draped nearby, the one with the stitched patches from last season's drive, and tucked it gently around her. She exhaled against my chest, a long, slow sigh that melted straight through to the center of me. "You smell like warm toast," she murmured. I laughed quietly, holding her a little closer. Warm toast. Not perfume, not something elegant, but something familiar. Something that meant comfort. Home. The other children went on with their stories and drawings, the occasional giggle filling the corners of the room. But here, in this small square of quiet, with a child's head pressed under my chin and the rain pattering its soft rhythm, I felt something settle inside me that had been shifting for years. This was what it meant to be a mother. Not the title, not the duty, not the endless need, but the quiet invitation to be the place someone runs to without thinking. I kissed the crown of Esty's head and closed my eyes. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to, and neither did I.